Greetings, dear listener. Subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new scary stories and support me with a like. Enjoy listening.
John and I have been friends since early childhood. Why, you say, from early? Yes, because we were brought up and grew up in the same orphanage. The upbringing of this institution did not benefit us, the benefit that we could bring to society. Rather, on the contrary, we could only bring problems to society. After graduating from a closed school for troubled teenagers, we were preparing to enter an ordinary and troublesome life, to which we had been going for so long. And the dashing 90s met us in all its glory, which led us into criminal activity. The country was going through difficult times. Many people simply had nothing to eat. But this was not about us, because we lived, as people say, in grand style. We quickly managed to get used to the gangster group, although almost the entire group consisted of athletes, like us, but, for some reason, we managed to get along. The work of the group was in full swing, without failures or any disagreements. Worked according to the classical scheme. Each person worked in his own direction. Someone was responsible for businessmen, someone for small hucksters, and John and I looked after the underground casino. When there was more work, I was sent to a neighboring city, where I had to retrain and began to look after a brothel. Then I lost sight of my friend for several months. After a while, he showed up and said that he had found his sister. I didn't know who my parents were or what was happening to them now, and I didn't try to find out anything about them at all. In the orphanage, I found out that they had left me in the maternity hospital. No one ever even tried to adopt me, and every year I cared less and less. The tech ended up in an orphanage when I was 8 years old, and he was not much older than me, only 5 months. His parents were complete alcoholics. My father died in a drunken brawl. His neck was broken. The mother completely drank herself to death and burned out within a year from the surrogate drink. Vitya knew that he still had a little sister, who at that time was not yet 3 years old. Where she was and with whom, he did not know throughout the entire time spent in the orphanage. So, he told me that he had found his sister, and we urgently needed to get on the road, that he had settled all matters, and we could go the next day. He also said that she was taken in by her mother's second cousin and taken to a distant, remote village, which was very far away, somewhere in Mordovia, near a huge forest. The people who lived there were mainly those who worked in logging. The next day, early and cold in the morning, we got into my Ford and hit the road. In one of the cities we were passing through, we went into a large store. We bought alcohol and various snacks to celebrate the meeting upon arrival. 4 days later, we arrived at the place. I really didn't like this outback. The people here were gloomy, and many pretended that we did not exist. We met a decrepit old man on the road, wearing his old cap, with a broken visor and a crooked grin. The tech glanced at him, and in response, the old man raised his right hand, smiling maliciously. I didn't pay much attention to it at the time and didn't even suspect anything, but in vain. After all, his gesture indicated the direction where we should go. We soon found where my friend's sister lived with her guardian. When we arrived at a house at the end of the street with a small plot of land, we stopped near a ditch to drain water and got out of the car. The house was very old, but quite well maintained and without distortions, but the fence was ugly, made of slabs of different lengths and thicknesses. On the road near the house there were 2 female figures, one of which was a girl of about 15, and the second was a fat and medium-sized grandmother, both in dirty clothes, as if they had been working from morning to night. The grandmother spoke first. She didn't even say hello. He showed up after all. I knew that sooner or later you would show up. Vitya did not pay attention to the grandmother, went up to his sister and gently hugged her. She didn't move, didn't even respond with a reciprocal gesture. Then I immediately realized that she had been sick for a very long time. The girl did not utter a single word. It was clear that she understood who was in front of her, and the reason for this behavior was not entirely clear, but her brother's behavior showed that he knew about it. Then, staring at the grandmother, Vidya told her, "Set the table, we'll celebrate." The grandmother silently walked towards the open gate and gestured to the front door of the house, with a very low and small porch made of almost rotten boards. We grabbed a case of amaretto from the car and an egg carton that was filled with various snacks. Soon we all sat down at a large table covered with an old sheet. 20 minutes later, the table was full of alcohol and snacks. In addition, the grandmother took out a cast iron pot with chicken and vegetables from the stove. We couldn't refuse such a treat. A feast with discussions began. Mostly, Vitek asked the questions. The grandmother, as it soon turned out, was called Baba Nastya, and she told about Chasey's illness and why she took her, very far from the city, to this wilderness. Midnight came when suddenly there was a loud knock on the gate and everyone fell silent. A moment later, they began to knock insistently on the gate. John silently stood up and headed to the door, and Baba Nastya saw him off with a drunken look and a grin. I also stood up and followed him. We went out into the yard, and without the slightest hesitation he pulled back the bolt on the gate and opened it with ease. Behind the gate stood two girls, about 25 years old. Where did they come from and why in the middle of the night? This puzzled me, despite the fact that I was already pretty tipsy. At the sight of these girls, JC began to laugh like a little child. Baba Nastya slammed the entrance door with uncharacteristic speed and abruptly closed it with a hook. Baba Clara's loud laughter could be heard from behind the door. I rushed to the door, but Vitek stopped me and said, "Leave them. To hell, we'll come back later. But for now, we have something to do. Mine is the one with red hair." He laughed loudly. I didn't argue. I liked the idea itself, and I was already imagining how much fun we'd have with these suckers. Vitek slowly opened the car doors and raised the front seat. With a gesture of his hand, he pointed to the back seats to the girls. "Please, scoundrels, sit down," he said in a drunken voice. Almost everything about this situation confused me, because we didn't even get to know them. It seemed like they were just mocking people in this way. It was also strange where they came from here at such a late time, because no one called them. Or maybe they were just attracted to my brand new car. The girls climbed in without further ado and settled into the back seat. We climbed in after them. I started the car and we drove off. I didn't know where to go, and John didn't put forward a single proposal on this topic. Having driven onto the road, I directed the car towards the fields, behind which there was a forest. I didn't even really notice this rash decision. Vitya turned to the girls and pushed one of them aside. He took out from under the seat a bottle of vodka, which I had thrown in just in case when I arrived in this hole. Having quickly opened it, he took a large sip, then threw his head up and let out a loud, piggy burp. John shouted in a shrill voice like an American cowboy, "Yoo-hoo-hoo," and immediately after that he farted deliciously. He's still such a pig. The girls sitting behind did not show any emotion. Neither smiles nor disgust were visible on their faces. At the same time, when my friend laughed loudest, I cursed him for such an act. I even had to open the window to ventilate the interior. The car was approaching the forest and had almost crossed a field. A cold wind blew through the open window. The situation was already starting to stress me out, and with irritation in my voice I said, "Where are we going anyway? There's nothing here." John didn't answer. He just glanced at me briefly. In his gaze I felt something wrong. I became very worried. Suddenly the girl sitting behind me said with a vile tone in her voice, "We are almost there." And then I was seriously scared. Fear crept into my soul like darkness. I slammed on the brakes, but it was already too late. The creature sitting behind had already grabbed me by the throat. The last thing I remembered was Chan's evil smile and a series of blows to the face and body. I woke up from the cold in the dark. My whole body ached and ached. My head felt like it was splitting. But most of all I was tormented by thirst. I was tied at the hands and feet. I tried to examine myself and felt that my collarbone was knocked out, and my ribs hurt especially badly. Everything became clear to me immediately. John did his best in advance. Hopelessness and wild fear weighed on me like a dead weight. I realized it was a trap. But how can this be? John, after all, we have been friends since early childhood. How could this happen? After all, we've been through so much together. I thought I knew everything about him, but it turns out I didn't know enough. I cried like a child, screaming at the top of my lungs. But alas, everything was useless. Time flew by almost unnoticed, and soon I noticed that morning had come. Sunlight was peeking through the cracks in the boards. Soon I heard voices and the approach of someone's steps. The metal lock clicked and the door opened. John looked very drunk in the sunlight and was constantly smiling. I realized that something terrible was about to happen. I cursed this creature, but he just chuckled, looking at me with his wild eyes, as if he was rummaging for my soul. I felt like death was awaiting me. It's a pity. It's a pity. But it's too late. There were more voices, and I recognized some of them. Apparently, life in this hole was beginning to gain momentum. The clink of buckets and the splash of water were heard. Someone was running along the wooden surface in the neighboring house, which was not far from my imprisonment. Does the world really seem so alive in the last minutes? He, without erasing his grin, struck several blows to my face and ribs, thereby breaking several more of them. He grabbed the rope that tied my legs and dragged me to the exit of the barn into the courtyard. I no longer screamed. The pain no longer bothered me so much, and I was no longer so scared. I managed to make out several figures. I recognized Grandma Clara, who was sitting at a small wooden table and rattling metal objects. I saw those girls. They were laughing. That old man with a crooked grin in a cap, who was also laughing. Vitya dragged me to Baba Nastiu and threw me near the table. I heard JC's ugly and retarded voice. Nom nom. Brother, let's yum yum. He laughed loudly in response to her. Come here, you're delicious. Baba Nastiu hissed, cutting the prisoner's throat. The pain was short-lived, and then the peace of darkness came over me. Oh, long-awaited vacation. See, scorching rays of the sun, beach, beautiful girls. On one of these resort evenings, I, a young athletic guy, fell for one beauty. She was simply irresistible. Long legs, shiny blonde hair, beautiful body. I knew she was my type. We met and fell in love with each other. Admit that there is no more passionate and hot romance than a resort one. We walked for a bit, then moved on to passionate kissing. I didn't pull the cat's tail and invited my new girlfriend to my hotel room. It seems that Irene was crazy about me too, because she wasn't embarrassed at all. We came to my room, but I did not take into account one nuance. I lived in a rather high hotel complex on the 8th floor, and exactly the same hotel complex stood opposite. The red-haired girl in the hotel opposite often watched me when I changed clothes, and did not make much of a secret about it. It was simply impossible to hide from her gaze. The curtains on the windows did not play a special role, because they were so thin that everything I did was visible through them. And there was so little furniture in my room that I simply had nowhere to hide. As I lay in bed with my blonde girlfriend, I felt that all too familiar gaze. This red-haired beast from the neighboring hotel brazenly glared at us, preventing us from making love. For some reason, Irene was very scared, quickly got dressed, and ran out of the room screaming. I went into a real rage. This red-haired fool had no right to interfere in my personal life. Succumbing to anger, I ran to a nearby hotel. But when I ran up to him and tried to go inside, I was met by a guard. Son, are you tired of living? Get out of here before you get hit by something. No normal person would climb here. Don't you see, there are only ruins all around. This is the first time I've seen someone try to come here. Even boys don't risk playing here. I didn't listen to the old man and didn't want to hear anything. I just screamed and swore at the red-haired girl in a striped robe who lives in this hotel. I said that she ruined my whole evening and did not allow me to spend time with the woman I loved. Son, you dreamed it. This is impossible. The ceiling on the top floor collapsed and killed an entire family. This whole building is collapsing. Up to the 5th floor there are no walls or ceilings, answered the stunned old man. I quietly walked away from the guard and walked around this abandoned building, which previously seemed completely normal to me. I saw him from my window every evening. That same evening, I got ready and left in the morning. I will never forget this resort. Oddly enough, I don't even remember Irene. I still wonder who this red-haired girl was. Was it just me or someone else who saw her? Why? Why did this happen to me? Maybe it was some kind of sign. Maybe she was trying to tell me something. So many questions, and all of them remained unanswered. That trip to the sea did not go well for us from the very beginning. There is a mystical story associated with it. It all started when my friends and I couldn't connect our vacations. Either my Costa's date was postponed, or Tanka could not leave the students. In fact, my husband and I usually went on vacation together, enjoying each other's peace and communication. But this time, celebrating my anniversary, we suddenly decided to go to the sea as two families. Sashka is Costa's childhood friend, and Tanya and I have known each other closely since college. They were married for almost 15 years and raised 2 children. The The boys were our godchildren, and we enjoyed spending time with them. You know, there are such children that you don't even want to be around, noisy, unkempt, and ill-mannered. These guys were, despite their age, completely tireless. Perhaps I have never met nicer children. No, they didn't stand at attention and talk in whispers. They were naughty, of course, like all children, but at the same time they weren't boring. Kostya and I didn't have children yet, and we enjoyed watching our friends' parental efforts from the sidelines. In general, I don't remember who first suggested going on vacation with friends, but I think it was me. And then, after discussing the idea with them, we also abandoned a plane. Let's go by car. Well, let's. The house by the sea had already been booked. Sashka and Tanya had already vacationed there. They promised the kindest hostess and excellent food. For the children, there was a playground with all sorts of horizontal bars and a small swimming pool in the garden. And for adults, sun loungers, umbrellas, and even soft drinks. All this charm was included in a rather modest fee, and the sea was 100 meters away. And now a myriad of things are finally crammed into the trunk. The cat was transported to Kostya's parents, and late in the evening we departed towards the sea. We had driven 200 kilometers when Sashka's tire burst, and the front one, which is especially dangerous. My friend miraculously kept the car on the road, although the speed was decent. Then I did not yet know what mystical story would be associated with this event. The men had to tinker with the jack, the spare tire, and the wheel wrench, but they managed it and we set off again. It's a bad omen, I thought then. I don't even know why. I'm actually not superstitious. I try not to bother myself with all sorts of nonsense. Diligently entertaining Kostya with conversation so that he would not want to sleep. I did not notice how I dozed off. There, in the dream, we were also driving south. Kostya was also humming something under his breath, and Sashka and Tanya were also walking closely behind us, from time to time, making some signs to us with their headlights. Sometimes Sashka overtook us and maneuvered dangerously between other cars. That's his joke. He is choleric by nature. I call such people an all-in. Well, you understand. Oh, he's crazy, I grumbled, and Kostya reassured me. He's not drifting. He's a great driver. Yes, he's bringing children. Somehow we need to be more serious. Kostya slowed down to please me, and Sashka had to restrain his dangerous impulses. At some point he stepped on the gas again. He overtook us, made a funny face at the window, and at the same moment his car suddenly lost control, began to swerve along the road, and ended up in a ditch, hitting a fallen tree with force. Then, with a start, and even a scream, I woke up. Kostya looked at me with concern, and in the mirror I saw Sashka's red focus. Did you dream about something? Asked the husband. Yes, nonsense. I'm thirsty. At a gas station at dawn, we fell out of the car, were able to stretch our numb legs and drink coffee. For some reason I was nervous about sleep. Apparently Tanya noticed this and kept trying to make me laugh. Listen, I interrupted her. Tanyush, let's pet the children in our car. We have more space. They will be more comfortable. Tanka was surprised, politely refused, but it was like the devil was pushing me. I insisted almost to the point of hysteria. Here Kostya, to moderate my ardor, joined in. So what? Yes, let them sit in the back. At least you can smoke in peace. We have a non-smoking crew. Kostya pushed Sashka in the side. He shrugged, and Tanya gave up. Do as you wish. She waved her hand, laughing. Sonya, Vanya, will you go with that Natasha? The children moved into our car with delight. It was indeed more spacious, and it was also possible to recline the rear seat backs. They fiddled around there and soon began to sniffle. Kostya still rode steadily for 100 kilometers, and Sashka played dangerous checkers. I almost fell asleep again, when suddenly, having overtaken us at the turn, his car began to swerve along the road wet from the morning dew. The Focus flew off to the side of the road and went nose first into a ditch, hitting its rear end hard against fallen trees. When we ran up, Sashka and Tanka had already gotten out of the crumpled car. There was blood on her temple, and he held his hand, wincing. No, it's okay. In the end, we didn't even stop at the hospital, but the back of the car, where the children usually sat, looked terrible. The door, trunk, and back seat were heavily damaged. I went cold. Yes, that's exactly what I saw in my dream. Tanya screamed hysterically at her husband. I asked so many times not to drive fast. Get on the road. Do you have any idea what would have happened if the children... Here she began to cry out loud. Our vacation, of course, was ruined. and mainly because of a terrible quarrel between friends, and I still, although almost 5 years have passed, feel cold at the thought of what could have happened that day if not for my dream. This mystical story happened to us. The worst hotel I ever stayed at was in Dora, just over the border in Syria, after I spent the day traveling from Jordan. This was 20 odd years ago. This place didn't look too sketchy at first glance. I crashed out in bed, but woke a couple of hours later covered in bed bugs and bitten to hell. I end up sleeping on the floor. In the morning I go to the loo and it's like the apocalypse in there. As if a prison dirty protest had been taking place for 10 years. Horse-sized cockroaches everywhere, and somewhere beneath the smeared shit and detritus was possibly a hole in the ground where you were meant to shit. It was so bad that when Trainspotting came out in the cinema a year or two later, I laughed at the toilet scene because it was so tame compared to what I'd seen in Syria. I stayed in a really sketchy hotel in Cairo, with mice running along the skirting and bare wires protruding from the wall just above my pillow. After a couple of days I wanted to find out whether the wires were live. So I touched them together and shorted out 3 buildings. The toilets were better though. Hitchhiking through the Yukon, I got a lift from a couple, boy and girl, who randomly pulled off the highway into a dirt road and drove 10 minutes into the middle of nowhere before insisting we all get out of the car, and they then showed me their collection of hunting rifles in the boot. That felt very sketchy indeed for a while, but being in Canada it obviously turned out fine, and it transpired they just wanted to show me a great view over the next town, and the mountains. Autumn, Dent, cold wind. The rains and approaching cold could bring despondency and melancholy to anyone, but not to me. Early on a cold morning, not finding anything to do on a day off, I packed my things, got into the car and drove to my, although not luxurious, but very beloved villa. Cold weather will not prevent me from spending a pleasant weekend in nature, barbecue, fresh air, and natural peace. Well, at least my body will move away from city everyday life, and I will be able to sleep and nourish my body with fresh air. I don't know why, but at the Dutch I slept much more pleasantly. Every time I fell asleep, I simply fell into the deepest sleep. If at that moment a symphony orchestra had started playing some kind of symphony, and even beating drums almost above my ear, I would not have noticed. This has happened before, but not that time and not that weekend. Arriving at the Dutch of that autumn day, the first thing I did was light the stove to warm up the house and marinate the meat. What's an outing without a barbecue? Then I began to restore order on the site. The usual routine. Remove fallen leaves, trim wild grapes that had grown on the veranda of the house, and a little cleaning in the house. While going about my normal business, I first noticed strange footprints on the grass in the patio. Of course, I understand that cats are walking around the property. Well, a neighbor's dog might have sneaked onto the property and left footprints, but so big. The tracks of an animal were clearly visible on the grass, but they were quite large and looked more like a bear's. It was clear how the claws of this animal dug straight into the ground as it walked through my area. I heard that last year a bear came out of the forest and made its way into several areas not far from mine, but I did not see it myself. But this year there was not a word about this, although my neighbor lives in his dacha 24/7, so to speak. He would have told me anyway if this had happened, but he never said a word. On the one hand, I have nothing to be surprised at since the facade of my dacha went straight into the forest. The area where my house was located was on the extreme line, and the fence of my house from the forest was separated only by a single-lane road 1 car wide. Essentially, looking out the window, I looked straight into the endless green forest, where I often collected mushrooms for soup and potatoes, which I usually fried for dinner. In this forest, only the lazy or the one who doesn't know anything about mushrooms would not pick them. After standing for a minute looking at the tracks, I threw away the bad thoughts. Well, he got through. Well, he walked around. The main thing is that he didn't break anything, and if the neighbor didn't say anything to me, it means that this beast, after it entered my territory, just as quickly got out of it. No worries. The day flew by unnoticed. It got dark. The noise of the forest brought only pleasure to my ears. Silence and the rustling of some remaining leaves. Somewhere in the forest some birds clicked and chirped. The shish kebab on the grill was almost ready. A clear glass, like hot meat, beauty. I didn't even notice that the time had already passed midnight. The weakness from the day, plus what I drank and ate, added a surge of laziness to my body. So I left the remaining meat and other food in the form of chopped tomatoes and cucumbers on the table in the open terrace. And that outside it was about zero, well, maximum plus 3 or 4 degrees, in a natural refrigerator. I found excuses for myself in order to postpone all the cleaning of grub until the morning, and with this thought I went to bed. That night, for some reason I couldn't sleep. My whole body was shaking inside, and my body was covered in goosebumps, as if I was getting sick. But that was not the case. The inner voice and sense of self-preservation screamed run, but I didn't understand what it was all about. By 3 in the morning I could not control my internal panic and decided to distract myself by looking out the window of my house to look at the forest. This used to calm me down, but now, looking out the window and peering into the darkness of the forest, I was horrified. From this darkness, 2 bright red glowing eyes looked towards my house and approached towards the house. From the horror that came over me, I curtained the window, trying not to look in that direction anymore, and sat down in the corner of the room away from him. There was silence for a minute or two, and through this silence I heard something or someone climb over the wooden fence, so much so that it creaked. The sound of a fall or jump to the ground and heavy footsteps already across the territory of my sight towards the terrace and the entrance to the house. Gathering my thoughts and taking my willpower into a fist, I sneaked into the next room on the second floor and looked out the window into the courtyard, where I could see the entrance to the terrace, although not all of it, but only a small part, but still. Looking out the window out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a flashing shadow and a dark figure. Cold sweat covered my body, and the thought that someone or something unknown was right under my door, and we were separated by only 1 floor and an old wooden entrance door, which was closed, albeit with an old but solid bolt. In fact, I was almost above him and heard everything that he or it was doing there. The slurping and noise of the dishes I left behind, the pan where the leftovers were stored. The ishleika fell to the floor and rolled down the steps to the entrance to the terrace. I picked it out, and what I saw did not make me happy. It was literally chewed up. An old enamel pan. The wall thickness is several millimeters, not counting the enamel. It's difficult to scratch it, and turning it into something like junk was beyond the bounds of fantasy. But this creature, I can't call it anything else, managed with this literally in seconds. Suddenly everything went quiet. At first it seemed to me that I somehow lost sight of the entrance and it went away. But then a sharp realization. It realized that it had been noticed and heard, and now they were trying to watch it. I also became quiet and tried not to even breathe so as not to give myself away. There was a knock on the door and a roar that I had never heard before. It went on the attack. Hit, blow, and another blow. It felt like they were hitting not only the door but the whole house at the same time. I didn't bother going down and checking the strength of the bolt and the door, but just ran into my room, which overlooked the forest, and locked the door. Yes, on every floor, and there are 2 of them in the house, and in every room there were old, good quality doors, and on each of them there was a lock. When I bought this house, it even amused me, and I didn't understand why they were there. Why lock each room in the house with a separate lock? But now I realized that the previous owners had probably encountered this something, or at least knew about it. Having ran into my room and closed the door, the only thing I could do next was curl up in the far corner from it, and listen to how something was knocking down my front door on the first floor with great effort. There was a crash and the door on the first floor crashed into the house with the characteristic crack of breaking wood. The tramp of heavy paws on the wooden stairs and the sound of scraping claws, and no longer a roar, but an ominous and terrifying laughter that penetrated the soul and instilled horror in it. It was more like a human one, but with some kind of echo that instilled horror and placed only one thing in the head: thought. It's hungry. It's coming for me. I'm finished. A knock on the door of my room and a roar of anger that the prey is not yet in his clutches and that another obstacle stands in front of him and his dinner, or rather me. Numerous blows, the cracking of wood. I felt that this was all my last night. Suddenly, not far away, a shot and barking dogs were heard. Neighbor, is it really him? A thought flashed through my head. The blows stopped, another shot was fired, and then the sound of paws was heard moving away from my door, or rather to the first floor. Another shot, almost at the gate, was followed by the clinking of glass and the stomping of paws turning into a run. Another second, and something was no longer moving in my house, but onto the terrace and then along the property moving away from the house. That night I was never able to leave the room or even get up from the corner of my room, and I sat there until lunch the next day. The neighbors' screams at night with questions. Are you alive there? How are you? I hope you're alive. How are you? They never brought me to my senses. Only the pain in my legs and the afternoon sun brought me to my senses. With difficulty I was able to get up on my numb legs, and I had to stretch my lower limbs for another half an hour, so that they would begin to move fully. And after another hour I was able to open the door and go down to the first floor. Wooden fragments of the door lay on the first floor. Torn hinges hung from the doorway, and through the broken window in the room opposite, a cold autumn wind blew at me. I didn't even ask my neighbor what or who it was, and why he didn't tell me about it earlier, and why it happened. At that moment, the thought stuck in my head that he knew everything about this, but I didn't care anymore. Having collected my things, and not even bothering to close anything, although there was something to close, there was still no door. I got into the car and drove home. Arriving in the city, the first thing I did was report a robbery. I think my neighbor will confirm that my house was broken into. The dacha is insured, and secondly, I posted an advertisement for its sale. Later, I transferred all rights to sell the house to a realtor, so that I would not appear there again. I still didn't understand what or who it was and what happened to me, but to this day I don't go out into nature anymore. You never know what could be hiding in the depths of our forests and more. The city, and only the city here. At least I know all the monsters that live in it.